Hello and welcome to Synthesized Sunsets. Today we are joined by a very special guest, Naomi Kanakia. Naomi is a literary critic here on Substack who writes about the publishing industry and the great books. Before her time on Substack, Naomi was an accomplished speculative fiction author, with short stories appearing in major outlets like Asimov's Clark's World and the Magazine of Fantasy and Science Fiction. Her Substack, Woman of Letters, has two main types of writing: more straightforward, critical pieces, as well as more experimental pieces that she calls tales. So, to start us off, Naomi, could you explain a bit about what a tale is to those who are unfamiliar with your Substack and how it ties into your general approach to literature?
Yeah, I mean, a tale is basically a short fiction, but it's not like traditional short fictions are like very fully embodied, like you're there in the scene with the character, and it'll be like you're in their point of view, like it'll be like George saw such and such on the windowsill, and like there's all these images and just scenes and stuff happening, all that. My tales are not like that. Mine are, I'm just telling you a story. I'll be like, George was a guy who was really sad, and his wife was about to leave him, and because he was cheating on her, but he thought it was, like I just tell you the story as simply as that, which allows for a lot more flexibility in terms of the scope of the story. I can cover a lot more time. I can change points of view. I can like comment on the story and like try and make various points. And so I do various things with my tales. Often I try to like illustrate some sort of point that I've been making in my critical essays.
When did you start trying out this format? Like, is there anything that motivated you to start doing this?
Yeah, I started writing in this format about a year ago. I had been reading a lot of these early prose fictions. I spent months reading the Icelandic sagas in translation, which are these like 13th century, well, they were written down in the 13th century in Iceland, and they're all told in like this very plain, unadorned style. So it's impossible to tell if they were written by different people. And they're prose fictions about basically people in medieval Iceland suing each other in order to avoid blood feuds. Like the most famous one, Njal Saga, starts because Niall's wife basically is mean to another guy's wife, and like it just steadily escalates with more and more like blood feud. And then the whole island eventually like gets together to try and stop everybody from killing each other out of these insults. And I was reading these, and I read like a few other early prose collections. I read the Decameron. I read Apuleius's The Golden Ass, and I don't know. I was really just struck by like what it was like to tell stories before our modern conception of storytelling. And so I started like trying to write in a somewhat similar style. And then I knew that like journal editors were not really going to understand what I was doing. So I started putting, I already had my Substack that I mostly talked about the great books. And so I started putting them on Substack. And that's where the magic started to happen.
One thing that I found kind of interesting when I started looking more into literature is our modern idea of like a novel and like a short story is pretty much just based on how long it is. Like in my head, I was like, okay, if something is this long, it's a novel. If something is this long, it's a short story. But in fact, it is kind of more than that, right? Like a novel is actually a very specific way of telling a story that took millennia to emerge. And it's not just the case that if you have something over a certain word count that it is a novel. And I think it's interesting that there has been this framework that is kind of crystallized around like what is short fiction that's sort of exclusive of ways of writing that were much more prominent in the past. And I think it's interesting that like you said, right? Like in some sense your tales could be considered a short story, but in other senses it might not be, right? Because it doesn't ask the same of the reader, like it doesn't pull them into your world in the same way. And so like if you describe it as a short story, it might be kind of misleading, right? Because people have this idea of what a short story is. But on the other hand, like it does sort of fit into the parameters of what is a short story. Do you think it's more likely that the forms of writing are going to kind of like blend together into like soup basically, or that they will be kind of like these distinct forms that people try to specialize in?
I think the novel still has a lot of life in it.
Uh,
People still enjoy reading novels. Well, literary novels, not so much, but other kinds of novels they really still enjoy reading. And the conventions of the novel and like the way that it pulls you in and it's very immediate and you're fully embodied in it and it like has these scenes and this action. Um, those have life. Short fiction, like traditional for short stories, I think don't really have a lot of life left in them. The readership is not really there. We before the podcast recording started, we were talking about Scott Alexander and rationalism, and like there are a lot of short fictions that people write that have a lot more life in them than the actual short story form than you might read in the Paris Review. Like, like when Scott Alexander writes some sort of parable, where you have like two beings talking about whether, being an edgelord is good or not. Like, that's a short story of a kind, but like people are interested in that. Like if someone writes some fan fiction or like some like erotic story, like people are interested in that in a way that they're not really interested in the traditional short story. So I do think like basically like web-based short fictional narratives are going to increase in popularity and still continue to have a lot of life. But like what we consider, the short story that we all learned about at school and that people go to school to write, like I think that's kind of gonna dwindle and die.
When I'm reading something, at least, I think the most energy intensive portion of reading is exposition, like reading through exposition. And I think short stories, by their nature and being short, they don't have oftentimes don't have all that much less exposition than a novel. I feel like they'll have less, but compared to like time spent reading, it's you have to go through so much exposition to get to like the good parts of a short story, and it's just pretty exhausting. But if you can read these like more tale or parable type stories where you kind of just jump right into action and you don't really know what's going on with like the background of the characters or whatever, but it doesn't matter all that much, then that requires a lot less energy to just get into reading. But also if you have something like some fan fiction, I mean, that completely eliminates the need for exposition, right? Because you already know all about the world or whatnot. Or if you can just have like a really long running like novel series or something, you get to know the characters throughout, but then like each additional book requires like very little energy to get into. And I think in general, just like people consuming any media just want things that are less energy intensive. So I feel like that's kind of part of the reason short stories are a bit dropping off.
I did want to add, like, do you think that this is mostly a result of like the internet and the attention economy, or do you think there are also just like other factors at work that make this form less viable than it was in the past?
Interest in the short story was declining for a long time, even before the internet. When I was growing up, I used to read these Gardner Dozois did these year's best science fiction volumes, and each year in the introduction, he would talk about like the circulation figures of the major journals, and each year it'd be like, Asimov circulation down 10%, etc. Like the heyday of the short story was a long, long time ago. But I mean, that's also true of the novel to some extent. I mean, yeah, I do think like the internet probably has a role. Like, I mean, what I would say though is more important is like a short story, traditional short story requires quite a lot of trust. Like right from the very beginning, like you're asked to like place yourself into this scenario and you often don't know the author if you're reading it in a journal. You don't necessarily know what the payoff is going to be, and it's just like I think that level of trust in authority is kind of gone down.
So, in some ways, do you think it's just pretty closely related to the declining trust in institutions, particularly literary ones?
Yeah, I mean, I think like the short story like heavily depends on prestige. And like this idea that like the editor has the ability to like figure out what is going to be, a story that's going to like wreck your brain, ruin your life. Um, and people kind of I don't know if they have that kind of trust.
That's kind of interesting. Like, I guess I never drew that connection, but that would definitely make sense that um, like not only does declining trust in literary institutions affect publishing in general, but like it kind of can unevenly affect interest in like individual forms of literature. I wanted to revisit Scott Alexander. So I'm assuming most of our listeners know who Scott Alexander is, but essentially he is a pretty influential nonfiction and fiction author who writes at the Substack Astral Codex 10, but previously wrote at his own website called Slate Star Codex. He's pretty closely associated with the rationalist community, which is essentially like this Bay Area centered, tech adjacent community that's kind of like interested in truth finding and also like the aesthetics around this pursuit. You know, like I think it almost it takes like an almost religious approach to just studying the truth, I would say. And Scott Alexander also does the short fiction in the form of parables. He will just start telling a story, and I think maybe even more than Women of Letters, like it kind of feels like something that actually happened. Like he will put this thing that says like epistemic status fiction at the top of the page, which is like a very rationalisty thing to do. But like I remember I sent like a tale by him about this person. Like it was basically about someone who invented this algorithm to create the most divisive like Reddit post, basically. And my friend was just like, "Oh, did this actually happen?" I'm like, "No, this did not actually happen. Like this is not real."
I mean, honestly, like it will really, whether he's a literary figure or not, ultimately, will really depend on the status of his copyright when he dies. Like if he names a literary executor who can go through all his writings and like start putting together a book and like packaging things, then like yeah, I do think he will be regarded as like a great writer. But like there are a lot of writers whose writing like kind of falls out of print or like ends up in limbo because like nobody really knows what the rights situation is like.
So I was reading this interview with Yoon-Ha Lee. Have you heard of Yoon-Ha
I've
Lee
heard the
before?
name.
Okay. So he had a pretty interesting quote in an interview about short fiction. And I wanted to see if you kind of like resonate with this. He said, "The whole point of a short story is to assassinate the reader. You don't have the time or the space to go to war or do large maneuvers. You can't do chapters of elaborate setup. There's much less room for character development. A good writer can get more character development in, but that isn't my particular strength. Anyway, everything in the short story has to drive toward a short, sharp point, whatever it is you're trying to leave the reader with at the end of the story. I say assassinate, and it sounds hostile because it is. I work better when I can think in terms of opponents. The thing is that I don't want the reader to see the short, sharp point clearly from the beginning, but I want it to make sense afterwards as the angle of attack. Tactical sense, I guess, in the context of the story's setup." So, like, do you at all like kind of resonate with this in terms of how you approach your tales, or do you think this is
Yeah,
just like
I mean
not
that's
really?
not how I do it. That's definitely the way that like I was taught to do it.
Uh-huh.
And the way you find success as a short story writer, you know, like the classic ending of Babylon Revisited, where you know the character is like he was sure that Helen wouldn't have wanted him to be so sad, you know, and you're like, oh yeah, like you know, like your guts are just like ripped out by the last line. The problem is like our guts have been ripped out too many times. We read too many stories going for that effect where like you know a bell rings at the end, you're just eviscerated by the story, and now like all the various ways that a story can eviscerate you, like I feel like if you're a short story reader you've already felt those. For me, like I really try to like play out some kind of situation and the various implications of this situation in a way that like you know makes some sort of concrete point that people understand. Like I wrote a short story recently about some Indians. It's basically about a Mars colonization program.
Oh yeah,
Um,
I read this. Yeah.
and in this Mars colonization program, it's like Elon Musk has a university where he sends people to Mars. And like if he and he it's totally meritocratic and like you just get in with a test. So obviously everybody who like gets in is Indian or Asian. Right? And then they all like there's all these Indian and Asian people on Mars, and they're like the whole pitch is like you're gonna flee all this racism in America and you're gonna go to Mars where it's gonna be perfectly egalitarian. And you know, on Mars, the white people are still on top. It's just like America. But then these Indians are like sitting around laughing because they're like, but at the same time, we are rich. Like we have made money here on Mars. Like we are not on top. It's just like America. We are rich. We are doing fine, but we are not in charge. And then like this Indian's kid wants to go to Jupiter. because he's like, on Jupiter there'll be real equality. He's like, good job, go to Jupiter. He's like, why are you going to Jupiter? We're already on Mars. And then my character starts laughing. He's like, at some point, like, he's like, people are gonna wonder, like, why are there so many Indian people on Mars? Like, did India colonize Mars? That was basically just like playing out this comical situation where, like, that's exactly what would happen if there was that style of colonization. Like, that's the reason there are so many Indian people in fucking Fiji, in Trinidad, in South Africa. It's like wherever like Anglo people go, like Indian people follow. Um, yeah, I don't know if you're like fully eviscerated yet. You're just like, yeah, that is what would happen. That would be a comical situation.
Do you think for your particular style of tale, like, is it like at all important for you for the audience to not see the conclusion coming, or do you think that isn't really so important
Yeah,
to what you're
they should
going
not
for?
see the conclusion coming.
Mhm.
Like you definitely have to like misdirect them at the beginning. You know, like when you start writing a story, there are basically like a few endings that are the obvious endings. Um, like you know, like the obvious ending is like someone gets to Mars, and you know, it's just as racist on Mars as it is in America, and like they're like oppressed and terrible. And so like and like life is miserable. And so like you got to avoid that ending, but then you also like obviously if it can't just be like, oh yeah, do you have a utopia on Mars? Like that's boring. So it has to be something that's not those two things. Yeah.
I guess there's sort of like a meta layer of a misdirection with the tale, right? Because it sort of presents itself as something that might be nonfiction, and then you're just like, oh, like wait, this is fiction, and that like it adds a little bit of spiciness. Even when you know that it's fiction, I think in a good tale like that, you're going to have that to some degree. Like, even though that Scott Alexander parable started saying epistemic status fiction, I couldn't help but feel like maybe this is something that actually happened before something like too absurd happens. I'm like, oh, okay, I guess this probably isn't something that actually happened. Especially
Yeah.
because there's kind of like another layer of misdirection in this particular story, right? Where like he kind of pretends to be some person that's not Scott Alexander, putting it on his blog and like reporting something that happened to him. So like not only is like the tale itself fiction, but also like the pretense of someone else guest posting it onto Scott Alexander's blog is like also fiction, I think, and that's like pretty interesting as well.
Yeah, with the tale format, it's actually very easy to seem realistic. People generally assume like the stuff in the tale format is true because you know, when you tell something in a short story way, like it's so embodied that like nobody could actually know that much detail. Like, you know, like, oh yeah, George was in a car crash and like time stopped and slowed down and like he saw a bird like sitting on the fence post, etc. It like it just even if it's something that actually happened, it seems fake. But with a tale, you know, it's kind of like, oh yeah, you know, like there are these two moms of kids in my preschool class and they're having an affair, like they're fucking each other, you know, and their husbands don't know, and they like arrange play dates with their kids, and they go upstairs and like, you know, they put on Cocomelon, and then they just go upstairs and have sex. Like it seems so realistic because if that was actually real, like that's exactly how you would tell the story.
There was a brief period of time during COVID where I thought it would be fun to start writing some horror. And I concluded that horror is probably most effective when the story starts as though it's something that actually happened. You know, like part of the reason that stories around the campfire can be so much more scary is because, like, you know, someone's just saying something and like it could be something that actually happened to them. And also why stories are so much more scary when you're a kid because you're just
Yeah.
like a lot less confident that this thing didn't actually happen. And I was
Yeah.
like, yeah, there's probably a reason that like creepypastas are so much more popular than just like random horror because there's just this extra layer of intrigue where you don't know if there's something that like actually happened and there's no way to disprove it.
Yeah. I wrote about this once on my blog. Like, there's basically this genre in medieval China called the strange tale. And these are like basically the government, I mean, the government would collect these compendiums of just strange occurrences. And like they were kind of just like creepypastas or like urban legends in that like the way they were told were so like misshapen that they seemed really true. You know, like the classic one is like a guy has sex with a woman and he wakes up and he's like covered in scratches. And then he goes back to find her again and he goes to where her house was and he discovers that there's just a hole in the ground and that there's a fox living in the hole. And he's like he had sex with a fox spirit. And like, yeah, it's just like that's the story. There's nothing more to the story. Like nothing bad happens to him. It's not like she haunts him or anything. It's like he had sex with a woman and it turned out she was a fox. And you're like, why would someone tell that story if it wasn't true?
I feel like in the context of long form, like the novel is just like so dominant now. But
Yeah.
are there any like kind of long form ways of storytelling that were crowded out by the novel that people might not know about that you're kind of a fan of?
Yeah, a lot of things that we now call novels basically like the novel has several different lines of descent. And one of the lines of descent is like the historical chronicle. So a lot of people would basically write chronicles or like slightly fictionalized chronicles, and that would just be like a novel. Like the classic one is Romance of the Three Kingdoms, which is the one of the oldest Chinese novels, and it's basically just an account of the breakup of the Han Dynasty and the Three Kingdoms period afterwards. And then in the Icelandic sagas too, there are a few that are like almost all the Icelandic sagas take place over 4 or 5 generations. And there are a few Icelandic sagas that are basically like the story of a community, like over like how this community changed and developed over like 4 or 5 generations. And I think like that kind of like historical chronicle form really ended up getting crowded out by the novel.
Do you know why that was?
I mean, that form like periodically gets rediscovered. Like there we have, James Michener was a very popular novelist in the 20th century he would write novels like Hawaii or the Caribbean, and they take place over hundreds of years and have these like several different stories, usually with characters that were descended from each other or somehow related to each other. And then, David Mitchell also has a similar form like that. But I think more it's just like fictionality became really central to the novel. Like something couldn't be a novel unless it was fictional. And then like certain techniques of embodying, of like setting scenes, like a very like strict point of view where you're like really inside the point of view character for the purposes of at least that chapter became really common. And basically like people just developed like a certain set of conventions that like over time narrowed the scope of what you would consider to be a novel, so that nowadays you could write, there are a lot of things you could write that hundreds of years ago we would consider those to be novels. Well, even hundreds of years ago they didn't really know what novels were. They're basically like a lot of forms of like long prose that historically speaking we call them novels, like Romance of the Three Kingdoms, but if you wrote them today it would be something else. Like they just wouldn't we wouldn't consider them a novel.
I feel like, yeah, I feel like nowadays we don't really have stuff that would be like hard to sort into either fiction or nonfiction. Like there's a pretty like wide gap between these. But I feel like in the past that probably like wasn't as much of a case. I feel like even your like more harder nonfiction things might be like some, I don't know, if you're someone who is like hired by some king or something to write an account of your life, and you're reading this, like this is supposed to be nonfiction, but obviously it's not going to be like 100% historically true. Like a ton of stuff's going to be embellished.
Yeah, like example, okay, it's like Moby Dick. Moby Dick has so many facts in it about whales and whaling. And if to a modern reader, you're like, why are you telling me about like portrayals of whales in pictures throughout times, or like the various different kinds of hooks and instruments you use to catch a whale? It's like half the freaking book is like all these facts about whales. To the audience that Moby Dick was intended for, they were highly interested in whaling. Like they knew Herman Melville as a basically as a writer of travelogues, and like who told people facts about what the life was like on the seas. Like if you look at like a lot of the older reviews for Moby Dick, they're like, love the whaling facts, loved all that, but just what is this story with Captain Ahab? Like this is such a bizarre story. Like why does this guy talk like he's in Shakespeare? Like this is weird. Give us more whales.
Why is this guy on this biblical quest in my whale facts book?
And like then with Moby-Dick, with his first few travelogues too, it's like I guess they were billed as like realist, like things that really happened. But like a lot of these travelogues, like how real were they? Like it was definitely a sliding scale. Like nobody knew what really happened to Herman Melville when he was out on the islands with the cannibals. So like, you know, people kind of understood that it was he claimed it was true, but like they believed that to varying degrees.
Yeah, I wonder if we've lost something by like artistically by not being having as much freedom to narrativize things because like now it's just so verifiable whether something is like true or not, and like it's harder to get away with something like that. It kind of reminds me of there's like that Ted Chiang story. Is it like is the truth of fact the truth of feeling? It's basically about like this oral culture that kind of moves over to the written word, and it kind of creates unrest in their society because like people start to realize that various tellings of their history are just like inconsistent, and people are just like, oh well, this can't be true and that can't be true, but the people who are really into the oral culture of the society are just like, well, that's not the point. Like, you kind of part of our telling our histories, you want to be able to like artfully narrativize these things. You're like ruining everything, but then it's
Yeah.
like told in tandem with this other story about people kind of like video capturing everything. And so now like every single like thing that has happened, you can kind of like check it against people's memory and be like, oh, this is like what actually happened. And I think like in both cases he's arguing that's like sort of a loss in some ways, even though it's like in some ways objectively good to people to know what like actually happened. I've seen a little bit of discourse recently about how we may be moving back into a more oral culture, in that like now it's actually becoming harder to verify things because you don't know something is like AI generated or just, you know, straight up not true. And like more and more you're going to have to rely on experts to say like what is true and is not true. And like in some ways this is like more of a return to the wise sage model where you just kind of have to like have someone you trust and just believe that what they say is accurate, and there's not really like a way to independently verify it. So I wonder if, like, in some ways, we're moving into a future where you actually can like do this kind of stuff again.
Yeah, kind of. I believe that that is the case. I mean, well, because like trust in experts is down so much, right? Like if a professor says something, people are like, who does this guy know? But what does this guy know? But like if it's somebody like if I say something like I have more credibility when I talk about English literature for my audience than actual professors do. That's I've been telling people lately that I like that I'm an influencer. Um, because and I've been like reading about influencers. And I was like, that's basically what an influencer is, right? Is like someone who performs some kind of authenticity so that people trust them. Like you seem like someone who's genuine and who genuinely speaks their mind. So like, you know, what you say, I think people understand that not everything you say is true, but they at least feel like you believe the things you say. And that like counts for more because like with experts, they're like they just don't know whether those people are like actually telling the truth or not.
I wanted to talk a little bit about sentimentality. In our previous Lost conversation, we talked a little bit about how Ted Chiang was able to succeed in speculative fiction because he was able to blend like this sort of hard technical ideas and like concepts for stories with like these very like this very like sentimental plotting and characters. And I believe you wrote an article about this in Women of Letters. So I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about like sentimentality and like why you're kind of like fond of it, and whether or not it's like I think that it's fair to say I think that sentimentality is sort of like out of fashion in like literary fiction, right? Why do you think that this is not the case in science fiction, given it's sort of like a, you know, more like stereotypically science fiction is kind of like a less feelings interiority based genre, right? But then in practice, you're saying that they actually reward a lot of this like sentimental stuff a lot more, right? So like
Yeah.
what do you think of this tension?
Oh yeah, like sci-fi short stories, especially the most critically acclaimed ones, are like wildly sentimental, right? And like every year, some like a science fiction short story will like win an award. That basically was like it was designed in a lab to win awards. Sometimes it goes too far. Like there's was one short story that I want to say is nominated for a Nebula, and it's basically about Omelas. Like it's a Omelas retelling this year. And it just is like a riff on Omelas, and then like the idea of like how sad it is that there's a kid who's dying. And it just like instead of one dying kid, there's like 10 dying kids. It just multiplied Omelas by 10. There's not really, it doesn't really say anything about Omelas. It's just like, what if there were 10 Omelases and there were 10 kids and people kept rescuing them and they kept dying and it was awful.
So
Like, good job. Okay, because science fiction people like can also be really like nostalgic. They really love fan service. So like if you combine a property they love, like Omelas, with like even more sentiment, they love it. I don't know exactly why. Like I think it's because the way these awards are voted is like a popular vote award. You know, it's kind of like why do things go viral on the internet? It's because it evokes some strong emotion. Similarly, like wins you an award in the science fiction world is like if people start talking about you, um, and like are remember your story sticks enough in people's minds that they vote for you, like coming Nebula time or Hugo voting time. And then because the point of writing these stories is to win these awards, like it kind of percolates down into the whole ecosystem. And because so many of the most highly acclaimed stories are like so sentimental, it kind of just like percolates down into the whole ecosystem. Like the best science fiction writers, you know, find ways of managing that sentimentality and like making it feel exciting or earned. Like that's really what makes Ted Chiang so great is like his stories are equally wildly sentimental as like this Omelas story, but like he gets there by a much different, more complex way with some sort of like insane premise, like, you know, what if like there was a language, what if you had to communicate with aliens and their alien communication language taught you how to see the future, but in order to talk to them you had to commit to never seeing the future, and then somehow, as a result of this, you have to let your child die in a climbing accident. You gotta let her die, and that's the story. Or like, what if you're a mathematician who, like, you know, disproved the fundamental postulates of math, and as a result, your husband doesn't love you anymore. Like these stories sound so insane when you describe them out loud, but like, you know, the genius is that he makes them work. Like when you get to the end, you're like, oh, guess she had to let her child die. Like this follows logically.
But saying all this, like, I feel like you do have a soft spot for sentimentality in writing, right? Like you've written about
Oh,
this
no,
in your
have I
novel.
given the impression that this is bad? No, this is great. I like this a lot. I just think like, you know, I'm like a connoisseur of these kinds of stories. So like I feel like you got to get there in a way that interests me. I mean, what's nice is like I made fun of this Yoon Ha Lee thing about ripping your guts out. But like when it comes to science fiction stories, what's great is like you can always innovate with like the science fictional side. Like the science fictional premise like always makes it really really new. So like you can always be like here's like some crazy situation that I've never thought of before, like with these really interesting implications, and then at the end like I'm emotionally devastated. um so I definitely like that. Like literary fiction tries to go for a similar effect, but like there the trick is like the story is so quiet and even the whole way through, and then at the end like it's suddenly extremely emotional. Um, not as interesting to me.
Would you like to see the sentimental novel come back?
Oh yeah, I mean I recently have you ever read A Little Life?
No, I haven't. I haven't read A Little Life.
It's this book by Hanya Yanagihara. Came out about 10 years ago. It's about this group of four friends in New York City who are all like making it, and like one's a lawyer, one's an actor, one's an architect. They're just like such good friends and they're just making it in the city. And then as you start reading, it starts flashing back to the life of like one of these characters, Jude, and like you basically learn that he was like raped and sexually tortured for the entirety of his childhood by varying groups of men. Um, and that has made him really sad. And it makes him really sad and hard to enjoy his glamorous New York life. That's basically like the sentimental novel structure is like somebody gets tortured and terrible things happen to them, but then there are also some good things, and like it's like this wild like balance of like the good and the bad. I don't know. I find it very, very entertaining. I would like if novels strove for like bigger emotional effects.
In like an earlier post that we wrote on the publication, we were talking about, I forget exactly what sentimental novel it was. We were kind of poking fun at her at the end, like the this character, like all this bad stuff has happened to her, but now her life is like fine. She's just like, oh, and like I am so glad this is true. And then like every single person in the whole room is like, oh, and I am so glad. And like I am so glad. It's just like ridiculously corny. But like, if you read the reviews of it on like Goodreads and stuff, even from like modern readers, it's like, yeah, people are still kind of into that. Like I was kind of, because like all the people who are writing their like literary critiques of this book were just like, oh well, this novel like obviously kind of sucks. But like if you go, I think on like Goodreads, it's like one of the most well reviewed books I've ever looked at. It's like, oh yeah, it was just like so emotional and stuff. I
What's
thought
the
that was
book?
kind of funny.
What book are we talking about?
Oh, I think it was I think it was The Lamplighter. It was The Lamplighter, I think.
Oh, The
By
Lamplighter. Did you
yeah, The
guys read The
Lamplighter.
Lamplighter?
I read part of it. Read part of The Lamplighter.
Oh, I have read The Lamplighter recently. Yeah. The Lamplighter is like a classic sentimental novel.
Yeah, I mean
Yes.
it's super popular.
It's about this woman who, this girl, this like 8-year-old girl whose mom is mean and basically like kicks her out of the house to like starve and freeze to death, and she gets taken in by this kindly lamplighter who himself is poor, and like he goes around the streets like lighting lamps. But she's so good-hearted. She's so good-hearted and wonderful that like all these people come out of the woodwork to help her, and she has a great life. So
It kind of reminded me of like Hallmark movies, like I feel like the types of people who used to read sentimental novels like now watch Hallmark movies, and like in a sense they've kind of been crowded out by this. Do you think it's the case that people really moved away from sentimental novels, or is it more that like I guess like the literati did, but like there were a lot of these same elements are just kind of continue to be present in genre fiction like up
I
until
think a lot
today?
of these same elements are highly present in like in women's fiction,
Oh,
especially like like Jodi Picoult has like, doesn't she have the book where called My Sister's Keeper, where like these parents like the daughter's kidney is failing or something, so they have another child just to donate a kidney to the first child, and then like that's really hard for her, like knowing that her whole existence is like contingent on the first child, like these like maximally sentimental scenarios are quite common in women's fiction. Yeah, I don't think human nature has changed at all. Like I think human beings still love these really sentimental stories. They definitely don't see a lot of literary people don't see a lot of literary merit in them, but I do think it's possible to tell them with literary merit. Like I think the problem is just like the ecosystem doesn't necessarily encourage literary. What's nice about the science fiction short story is like, with the exception of this Omalá story, like there is some desire to like hold these sentimental stories to like some standard. Like that's how you get Ted Chiang. Like that's how you get someone who like is able to like bring like the highest standard of artistry to like telling these kind of stories. Otherwise, like with other genres, like when if the writers are not being held to like a high literary standard, then you know they don't get pushed to like really refine it that way.
I haven't thought about this before, but I feel like a lot of this actually might explain a lot of the popularity of biographies. Like, I think a lot of this sentimental energy has been channeled into like very particular type. Like, have you read Educated by Tara Westover?
No,
So like Educated is really, really like one of the most popular books ever,
I've
I
heard of it.
think. Yeah, and like it's especially, I think it's especially popular in like amongst people who would watch like Hallmark movie and stuff. And yeah, it's just the story of like this girl who has this really unstable childhood. She doesn't really have anything, but then suddenly she's like going to like prestigious university. She's like at Oxford, and she's able to like pull herself up by her bootstraps. And like,
Oh
yeah,
yeah,
I mean, it's just like very sentimental, and like I think people get even more into it when it's like a true
that's
story. Like
true. Oh my
it
gosh,
really, really, really
someone's selling
happened.
it to me. Like I want to read Educated now.
But and like another one I can think. Have you heard of like When Breath Becomes Air by like
Yes, yes, I have read When Breath Becomes Air.
yeah,
Yes,
like it's about the D. Gordon. Do you know about this book?
yeah.
Not really,
Like
no.
it's
Or
like
vaguely, yeah.
this like neurosurgeon that like he gets like what brain cancer, right, or
How he
some
gets
kind,
brain cancer?
yeah, yeah, terminal brain cancer. And it's like he's writing this book at the end of his life where he's just like, well, like I'm like grateful. He's writing it like as he's dying, literally, and it's just like I'm grateful for like
No,
all these things. It's like so
it's pretty
yeah.
wild.
Yeah,
Yeah, like the book
and
is unfinished because he dies. I don't think it's actually unfinished. I think it's just like, at some point he has died. Like he's told the whole story into the first person, and then like the book is over and it got published basically after he died, with an afterword from his wife.
Yeah. Did you read like the last lecture? That was like
yeah,
very similar vibe.
Very
Yeah,
similar.
yeah.
There were a
yeah.
few of these
Yeah.
like I'm dying books.
Mhm.
No, and these are like the most popular books, right? Like, I
Oh,
mean,
yeah.
like, well, educated and like, I don't know, like, yeah, so many more people have read these books than like.
One of these books made a man vice president. Hillbilly Elegy.
Yeah, true. Yeah, yeah. I guess that's funny. Like, yeah, considering Hillbilly Elegy is like a sentimental novel.
That's how powerful it is. You could become
uh,
president.
this is like not super related, but in like the Remembrance of Earth's Past trilogy by Cixin Liu, like I think what you were saying definitely applies. Like there are some parts of the book where there's just this very ridiculous technical premise that leads to something that's just like super sentimental. Like there's this one part in particular where like this one guy just like has a crush on this girl who's like in his astronomy or physics class or something.
Just
Um,
yeah, fellow
yeah,
college student.
yeah, and he ends up like buying her a star. Like he ends up becoming like super rich later in life, and there's some process by which you can like claim ownership of like a star basically, and she like yeah
Oh,
buys ownership of this star for her like anonymously. So like she has no idea. She just knows that someone has this secret crush on her that's so much that like he bought her a star. And then like there's this point later in the book where he basically volunteers for this like suicide mission where he's gonna like get his brain extracted and like sent into space to the aliens and like probably won't make it. Like they're basically just banking on the fact that the aliens have the technology to like revive him. And he's like, and like the person in charge of this mission is actually the girl he had a crush on, but
oh.
he's like never told her. And so there's like this moment where he's like finally like about to like be sent off. His brain's about to be sent off into space, and someone tells her like, "Yo, this guy that you're like sending to space to die basically is the person who like bought you the star." And then she just has this moment. She's like, "Oh my gosh, like he's the one," and like she really wants to like tell him how like grateful she is for this gesture. But then like when she gets there, he's like already in the operating room, like his brain music's playing. She's
Never
like, "No, no, no."
Oh, good job.
Oh, it was so good. So over the top.
So good. Yeah, it actually ends up being like very important later in the book, like everything, like the star that she bought, and like this.
He's like dying anyway, which is like also part of it. Like regardless, right? Even when he
He's
buys
got
the
no
star,
time to
he's
waste,
already like
no time to
terminally
waste
ill.
to like, make a kiss or two, take a walk on the beach with this lady. He's got to go die in space.
Yeah, and I think like something about it felt very like Chinese too. Like I think there is this like pretty common stock story, and I mean this isn't just limited to Chinese stories, but I think it's more common where there's just like a bad ending, where there's these two people that are kind of like destined to meet, except like unlike in Western fiction, they kind of just like get fucked, and they feel this very deep sense of like cosmic separation, sort of that goes beyond just like a normal relationship. And like I think this is a pretty common theme throughout the trilogy, where like there is like sentimentality related to like like these people will never meet, or like these parts of humanity will never be brought together. And I feel like this kind of worked well with the sentimentality to make it succeed in like in science fiction specifically, where I think a lot of other like Chinese stories would kind of like fail to resonate. And I'm curious to see like how Chinese science fiction is going to interact with Western science fiction into the future, because like there was a like in 2023, I mean you probably know this, but like the WorldCon was held in Chengdu in China. And like I think one of the more interesting results of this was that like there were a few Chinese works that ended up on the Hugo ballot the next year that had just never been vetted by a Western audience. Like of course
Oh,
Remembrance of Things Past.
because there were so many nominators who were Chinese.
Right.
Yeah,
um
maybe.
and like these works, like they not only had they not been published in like an American magazine, but like they just straight up never been translated into
Never been
English.
translated. Oh my god.
And so like there was this guy that they basically got to put out a collection of Chinese short stories, like an anthology that included these Hugo nominees, because like the Hugo voters need to be able to read them. And I think that I looked into it. I think some people were like, there were like people like hated these. Like if you go to the Reddit thread where they're doing a read along of these nominees, like writers are just like in disbelief of like how bad these stories are, and they're just like, well, like maybe the translation was bad, or maybe like the CCP like stacked the ballot so they could like ensure that these certain stories got onto the ballot and stuff, and these weren't necessarily the best ones. And they're like, trying to make all kinds of excuses for these stories to make them fit into like their standards of quality. But I was looking into them, and I don't think there's any reason to believe they don't reflect like the sensibilities of like the domestic Chinese audience. And like
Yeah.
it was just like really interesting, like a really interesting cultural event, like to see the
That's
reactions and stuff like
fascinating.
that.
Wow.
This might actually make it so that these two spheres never really merge in like a real way, because there are stories that have crossed the Pacific and done well in America, but to be honest, I feel like most of these reflect the sensibilities of Ken Liu, who definitely
Yes.
like, he's been the one that's translated like almost all the ones that have actually done well in the West. And
Yeah.
there are these Chinese writers that exist and write in this like Western speculative fiction tradition, of course. Like China is a big country, but I think a lot of Western audiences mistakenly assume that these are representative of what's actually popular in China, and so people just be like, oh well, this story is bad, but like there's folding Beijing, so obviously this doesn't reflect what like Chinese readers actually want. But like, in fact, there may just be these different standards of quality, and like I think that's pretty interesting. I think one thing that's interesting about a lot of literary criticism, even like genre-based literary criticism, is that like people kind of treat these conventions of quality as though they've always existed. And like when a convention changes, I feel like there's kind of like a rewriting of history, where people are just like, oh yeah, there is just like this consistent notion of like what has been a good book. And I think people are almost even reluctant to admit that there could be a different way to like evaluate something literary quality. Like something that kind of annoys me in a lot of genre fiction discussions is someone will be like, well, things can be literary and like they can also be escapist, and like it's okay for something to be escapist. And there's not even really an acknowledgement that something like being good science fiction could be anything other than just like some combination of having like a lot of like literary merit in the way that we think of now, and just being like escapist entertainment. And like I think people are a little bit unwilling to consider that there may be another way to evaluate like books. And like, yeah, I think this goes beyond literary criticism. Like we saw this in this like fantasy Hugo nominees thread, and like I'm kind of wondering like why that is, and whether that's always been the case. Like if in the past people were a little bit more fluid in terms of how they evaluated literature. Like, do you get the sense that people were a little bit more like willing to like evaluate books on like different axes in the past, or do you think there's always kind of been like this pretty narrow framework through which people evaluated literature that's changed over time?
Well, I mean, the number one thing that determines whether a book is perceived today as having literary merit is whether or not it lasted. Whether or not people were willing to put a lot of time and energy into copying it down and preserving it. And I think like that was the medieval version of winning an award, is like some abbot would order some monk to like spend, half a year and the equivalent of like, 100 sheep worth of parchment, painstakingly copying it down from one codex to another. Like the and most works, especially most secular works, did not win that award. Like a lot of sermons won that award. A lot of like of these like abstruse like religious texts about like how many angels can dance on the head of a pin won that award. But like the number of like what we would call literary texts, like secular literary texts that won that award, is very small. And so something I think like now we have this like kind of awards ecosystem, and like we have this like critical ecosystem that like we hope like approximates like what the energy that makes a book last. But I do think we are finding that it doesn't necessarily do that. That there are a lot of writers who have lasted in various ways that are not like kind of like the kind of writers who win awards. Like, you know, when you were talking about different ways of being good, I was thinking of this book novel called Eliyahu Goldratt called The Goal. This guy was basically a business, I don't know, he consulted in like how to make factories run better. And so he wrote this novel to try and describe like how to improve the amount of stuff your factory was building. Because basically like what you do is you find bottlenecks in production and then you eliminate those bottlenecks. And it's about this factory manager who like comes to this factory and like slowly by tinkering here, tinkering there is able to like double production. It's a pretty good novel. And this novel, like, you know, has lasted now 50, 60 years, in large part because they teach it in business school. That's neither literary nor escapist, but it's recognizably a novel, and it has lasted probably much longer than most books that were published, I want to say in like the 50s or 60s, whenever this book first came out. So like, you know, our current like prestige ecosystem is basically like 100 years old. We might discover, like, as time goes by, prestige ecosystem doesn't necessarily have a lot to do with whatever it is that makes books last.
Mhm. You talked a little bit about how, like, you know, speaking of authors that aren't like conventionally like literarily attractive, like you wrote this article about Isaac Asimov and like his presence in like this other canon of science fiction that exists, the shadow canon. Well, one thing I kind of liked about that article is how you talk about like how science, like people who are really into science fiction are like, you know, like to think that or think of like literary fiction as, you know, being like dismissive of them or like kind of disparaging towards them, when in reality they just like don't think about them at all. Like they kind of just like don't really even know that there is this like thriving parallel literary ecosystem. um but I was wondering, like, do you think that you talk a little bit about how the like the shadow can has proved to be like pretty durable, like, you know, maybe in which is maybe surprising considering the circumstances. And I was wondering, like, how durable do you think like the shadow canon, like how much durability do you think the shadow canon has left? Like, do you think that the shadow canon will kind of like continue to persist as this thing like well into the future, or do you think it's kind of destined to be just generally folded into the current like literary canon?
Well, you know, like it is interesting because authors like Isaac Asimov and Robert Heinlein, like they have not really been assimilable by the canon. Like there are definitely science fiction writers that, you know, have gotten like the Library of America treatment, like Ursula K. Le Guin, and Philip K. Dick. But like there's definitely another very broad swath of science fiction writers who like there's just no way of like convincingly making the case that they have literary merit. But like at least within the context of like the people who assign like whatever decide what literary merit means. And yet their books, you know, have endured, are influential, continue to be read, continue to be enjoyed. And like what I mean, I feel like our conception of literary merit will have to change to account for that. Especially because like I do think the prestige fiction ecosystem is quite unhealthy right now. You know, like I don't know that there's necessarily a lot of interest in like this like prestige fiction. And science fiction too is also some pretty unhealthy. But like the science fiction back catalog seems like, you know, like when you consider that like the science fiction back catalog is like basically able to persist year after year, without any really institutional support, like without like a lot of professors studying it, like without a lot of like at like being like locked into place, like I do think like the chances of that back catalog lasting for another 100 years are pretty good. Like when you consider that like the academic humanities are like in such trouble, like both in terms of credibility and in terms of funding. And you can already see that with the way that like a lot of 19th century American like, literary writers, like they're not necessarily that well treated or well studied. Like, like James Fenimore Cooper. I recently went into a phase where I started reading a lot of James Fenimore Cooper, who read Last of the Mohicans. And like basically all the editions of his work were quite old. Like the prefaces were quite old. There's hardly anybody who still studies him today. And this is like a major, major writer from the past. Whereas like I think like the number of people who would be able to like tell you something about, say, Isaac Asimov or Alfred Bester or like C.M. Kornbluth is actually a lot higher than could tell you something about James Fenimore Cooper. So yeah, like I think just in terms of like passing that test of like, will this get copied down and inscribed for the next generation? I think science fiction is doing better.
I think that's a pretty good time to wrap things up. So as a final note, do you have anything you would like to plug and any short stories you would like to recommend?
I just subscribe to my newsletter. That's the most important thing. Woman of Letters. Yeah, I have a story coming out in Lightspeed called Domestic Disputes. It's like my first tale style story that I've actually sold to a regular journal. So I'm excited about that. Yeah.
All right. Well,
Awesome.
thanks so much for coming on, and we will see you all next week.
Thank you.
Welcome back. So, any thoughts on the episode, Kevin?
Yeah, so I would first like to acknowledge that we actually had Naomi Kanakia on about a month ago, but then I'm a dumbass and we lost all of the audio files to this episode. And so that episode was never released. But the upshot was that we did kind of get to have a practice run of the conversation. And I think that our second conversation ended up being a lot better as a result. So I want to talk a little bit about that. I think that in the initial episode, I was focused a lot more on Naomi Kanakia's writing when she first blew up on Substack, and also her body of work from her earlier sci-fi career. I feel like for a variety of reasons, this didn't end up being a super fruitful subject of conversation. But I also felt like there were other areas of conversation that were really quite interesting. One of them was the publishing industry. But I feel like the most interesting subject that came up was Naomi Kanaki actually had a lot of thoughts on the sci-fi short story as a form specifically, not to mention the short story as a form in general. And so in this conversation, I tried to focus a lot more on that. And then we also were able to talk a lot about sentimentality, and specifically sentimentality in sci-fi, which is also a thing that Naomi Kanakia has a lot of opinions on. And so I think that generally went pretty well. And I guess it was good in that I felt a lot more prepared going this time around. Obviously, I still wish that I had not lost the files, but it was like a good learning experience in terms of like, having a conversation and then being able to think like, okay, how could I have done this better? And I think it just in general gave me a better frame of reference for how I want to approach conversations like that in the future.
Yeah. I definitely agree with this. I feel like especially Naomi Kanaki just has so much knowledge about like the history of writing and is just like able to pull so many random facts about the evolution of forms of writing throughout history and whatnot.
Well,
I
and,
thought
and speculative fiction in particular.
yeah, exactly. And yeah, so I thought it was pretty interesting to just like talk kind of theorize about like whether the short story and novel are sort of like inevitable like forms kind of to come across, or yeah, whether we could have something completely different, as well as like the barriers between fiction and nonfiction kind of.
Yeah, I guess something I think I did like a wrong assumption I made, or maybe a correct assumption that I didn't make, is that despite Naomi Kanaki having a ton of analysis of like the evolution of literature throughout history, and also being really, really into sci-fi for like a couple decades, I didn't really assume that she would have a ton of opinions about like the evolution of sci-fi literature. Like, I
Mhm.
guess I kind of like compartmentalized in my brain. I'm like, oh, well, she wrote sci-fi, and oh, she is really interested in like critical analysis of the evolution of literature. But I didn't put it together and be like, well, she probably has a lot to say about the evolution of speculative fiction as a genre as well, which just would have been a much more interesting thing to ask about.
I think it sounds unreasonable when you frame it like that, but I do think like the like evolution of fiction is kind of like a more natural lens to view things from, like in like a literary fiction sense, and like I think you can kind of imagine it as like, I don't think it would be unbelievable if she had transitioned from like more sci-fi speculative focus into a more literary focus, and then after that gotten into the evolution
Yeah,
of
that's kind of
literature
what
and
I was
stuff.
thinking. That's kind of what I
Yeah,
was
yeah,
thinking.
yeah. I don't think that's an unreasonable assumption, even though obviously it proved false. But
So before we recorded the episode, I remember you saying that you had this take about classic books, but then I don't remember you actually saying this take during the episode. So I was just wondering if you can remember what that take was and share it with the class.
yeah, I think when we look back at more classic books, it's like to some extent the measure of like their quality is the fact that they're even still remembered today, right? Like they've just like stood the test of time through people, and that's kind of like separating like this masterpiece from like the rest of the chaff or whatever that was shown to be just like kind of its time trash and stuff. um and as a result, these are the books that like people are, whenever someone's trying to get into like reading more like classic literature, older books, like these are what get recommended and these are what people read. And I feel like for a lot of people, they just like don't enjoy them that much, and kind of get turned off. Um, and I think this might be because that like this style of book that stands the test of time, it's like very literary and complex and sort of hard to get into, and that's not really a characteristic of it being in the past too much. Like, I think if you just took some like random 19th century novel that's just like overly sentimental and just like was really popular in the 19th century, but like because it was kind of not didn't have much literary quality, like no one knows about it today. But like instead someone like read that as their first foray into like greater classic literature, they might actually have a higher chance of liking that.
Mhm.
Because like I feel like maybe what the taste is of the average person might not have actually changed that much, and it's just like when we look back we only see like the tastes of like the elite of that time, kinda.
Mhm. Um, I guess I would concede this to some degree, but I also think that a quality of classic literature is that it doesn't date itself as much.
Yeah.
Like, I think that part of the reason that people don't read those kinds of books, a lot of times they make all kinds of cultural references and use slang that we just wouldn't understand now. And so I think that there is a little bit of a force pushing in the other direction where it's also like, okay, well, how well does the spirit of this novel translate to our current era? And I think for a lot of pop lit, it just you would like if you had been born in the context of that era, you would like it somehow. But like, looking back, you're just going to be a bit confused.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. And I would definitely agree. And I think certain books, I'm sure, like are more dated than others and whatnot. But I do think it's kind of interesting in that to some extent, like one thing, I don't know, reading historical literature is sort of supposed to give you is kind of like a window into like what people like at that time read and enjoyed and thought about and whatnot. And I feel like to some extent actually reading the things that rise to the top, like you're not actually getting that, because like you're getting this just like exceptional view of like what this like somewhat exceptional person thinks and their ideas and stuff, which is really cool too. But it's like I think you might be able to get a greater window into like what the life of the average person, and what their beliefs and thoughts were by just like reading some more like popular book of mediocre quality.
Yeah, I would certainly agree with that. I mean, I'm an advocate of reading books that are just kind of okay from an era. alongside those classic literary novels. Also, so you can get a greater appreciation for these literary novels. Like, it's hard to tell why Jane Eyre is so great if you don't have a benchmark to compare it to. But I do think it would be kind of funny if in your English class, like the first book you read is just this like unreadable Penny Dreadful about some vampire, and then like once you're done with that, you read Jane Eyre and you're like, oh my god, thank God, like that was so bad. Because I will say, like, as much as people shit on like romance and stuff like that, I would say that the average quality of writing has gone up a lot because people have learned what a mass audience likes and responds to. And I think that this is less about prose actually and more just about storytelling in general. We have learned a lot about the art of storytelling through the evolution of mass media. Like, we have in general gotten better at telling compelling stories through books, through TV shows, through film. And if you go back in history, there just hasn't been that process of development. And so people just don't really know how to write suspense or how to, like, there's not really as much inspiration that they can draw from. So I will say that it may be true that what they were trying to go for is probably better in line with what the average person would want to read now. But I think that they're also pretty likely to fail as a result of just not being very good at narrative techniques. And you're insulated from that to some degree by reading like the best of the best writers.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think that's fair.
Like, for example, like a cliffhanger was like a thing that had to be invented.
Yeah.
There's a lot of narrative devices that just had to be invented. And when they came out, people were just like, holy shit, that shit we were reading before was trash. And I don't know. I don't really think you can overcome that.
Yeah,
like,
maybe.
I think actually probably people have gotten a lot better at writing like thriller and suspense.
Yeah. I can see that particularly as being like the most dramatic difference.
Yeah, and that's kind of consistently one of the biggest, right? And mystery, right? I'm sure people have gotten better at writing mystery. Like,
probably.
Like now there's all these tropes that we know about. Like, probably you pick up some mystery from the 1700s, you just immediately know what happens. Like, that guy, he did it. But like in the 1700s, you're like, oh, whoa.
Yeah. I wonder if it's a thing where it's like we've simultaneously become higher quality, but also made it like worse for the audience on average because there's just like people just like know all the tropes too much,
No,
like,
I think that's actually true.
Like in the 1700s, it's like it wasn't all that hard to come up with like a new mystery. Where now you have to just
Yeah. No, I think that's definitely true.
So, Kevin, you wrote this article about Scott Alexander's fiction, which we also talked a bit about on the podcast as well. But yeah, could you kind of just give the rundown on this article?
Yeah, so Scott Alexander, for people who are unfamiliar, is this pretty famous intellectual in like weird tech circles, especially in the Bay Area. And he is primarily known as a nonfiction writer, but I want to make the case that he's actually a very underappreciated fiction writer, in part because his nonfiction overshadows it. But I also think it's because his fiction is not super legible in the context of the modern literary landscape. Like, it's a little bit hard to classify. It's hard to say, oh, it's like this or it's like that, because similarly to his nonfiction, it's kind of idiosyncratic and hard to categorize. And so I want to provide 3 different frames through which to understand Scott Alexander's fiction. The first such frame is understanding it as hard speculative fiction, which sounds a little bit odd if you are familiar with Scott Alexander's work, because the premises that he works with are not particularly hard or technological. He doesn't spend a lot of time talking about astrophysics or anything like that. But what he does do is he really, really takes the premises of some story to their natural conclusion. Perhaps more than any other author I can think of. Like, he just really thinks about how this would really, really, really actually play out. And I think that this gives his stories a unique sort of hardness to them, especially when coupled with the fact that their premises are often kind of not sounding like they're supposed to be that serious. And so he's kind of able to balance this like silliness and seriousness in an interesting way. The other lens that I used is understanding his fiction as tales, which is this format that we expanded upon at length earlier in the podcast. But basically, the idea is that there's something a little bit liminal about them in that, you know, you're not really fully immersing yourself in the story world in the same way. Scott Alexander kind of just starts talking about something, and you can kind of decide whether to buy into his reality or not. And sometimes it's not even clear if what he's saying is fiction at all, which can kind of add to the story. And then the last lens I use to think about Scott Alexander's fiction is a Jewish one, where I think that the way in which Scott Alexander engages with certain topics, if you just shift your perspective a little bit, it's actually a pretty good fit for a certain genre of Jewish literature. I guess kind of like an older style. It's like there are these stories where there's kind of just like this crazy, convoluted, sort of silly dialogue between Jewish people and Gentiles, and it always reaches some kind of like amusing but satisfying conclusion that's all tied up together in a bow, and often involves like kind of like outwitting God or something to that effect. And this is a theme that's really, really present in Scott Alexander's stories. And I think that it's actually, I think it's difficult to separate from his writing. And honestly, a big part of my enjoyment with Scott Alexander's fiction is that I know he's going to come at it with that perspective.
Yeah, personally, I prefer his fiction. Anytime I read a Scott Alexander story, I am like, wow, he is the only person in the world that could have written this. Like that this story would have just, you know, languaged in not existing for eternity if Scott Alexander hadn't come out here and written it.
To be fair, I think you can say that about a lot of his nonfiction as well.
I think a good amount of the nonfiction as well. And I mean, I do think that's like, I think there's a good amount of his nonfiction is like more poetic and idea focused, and some of it is like more empirical and like really getting down to the facts. And I think he's very good at that empirical type stuff, but simultaneously it feels like more replaceable. I think a lot of people are sort of good at empirical analyses. He just really has this interesting combination of just like writing like with this witty but poetic style, but also just like everything follows by something being literally true when it really shouldn't be. In the article, you reference the story, It Was You Who Made My Blue Eyes Blue. I read this story yesterday, and I think it's it's up there in terms of my favorite one of his stories. It was really good. Basically, the setup for this story is that there's this tribe of like super intelligent Polynesians kind of in like the 1500s or so, or I don't know exactly when, but they get a European explorer comes to them, and they're basically, or okay, I guess they become super intelligent from this drug on their island, and then they use this super intelligence to fulfill the ridiculous rituals of the volcano god of the island, and that is the purpose. And this explorer just like offhandedly kind of mentions that this is like the first time he's seen blue eyes, and there's this ritual that the people have, that if anyone knows 100% that their eyes are blue, then they have to kill themselves. And yeah, this is such a ridiculous premise for a story, but I don't know, works really well and feels like something only he would write.
Have you read any of those like old Jewish stories?
No, I haven't. And maybe I should, because whenever I see like a quote from them, it's like it's always so hype. You know, it's just like it's cool to imagine some just like old timey rabbi just being like kind of like arguing with God. Like the law says this, I interpret it to mean that, and then God's like, I'm literally telling you like that's not what it means. I feel like there's like some famous joke or something, which I'm sure I'll butcher, but it's like sort of like there's just like kind of like two like rabbis are arguing about like, you know, what the meaning of this certain passage of the Talmud is, and then like God like butts in and it's just like, oh, like it means this, and they're both just like, don't ask you, go back. And yeah, I feel like that is kind of the vibe for some of these things.
I think you would actually like these stories a lot. Like if you like Scott Alexander stories that much, like I think that is actually the quality that you're looking for.
Yeah.
Do you like Jewish humor?
Yeah. I do think so.
I remember this one time I just was on the Wikipedia page for Jewish humor. That was a good day. that was a good day. There's so many bangers.
Yeah. Yeah, maybe that is a good idea. Although I do also feel like Scott Alexander's just like prose style is also just like very good.
Yeah, I agree.
Which might not carry over as well.
I also want to ask you this, which do you think that you would enjoy Scott Alexander's fiction the same amount if you didn't know about his nonfiction? Or like, how much does your knowledge of him as like a writer of nonfiction, how much does that enhance your enjoyment of his fiction?
Like only like a very little bit. But yeah, I don't think it's really that important. But I think it's almost mainly just because like in a sense of like, holy shit, he's flexing. Like just like the fact that it's like Andy like this is like this story is like so good, and this is not even his main thing that he focuses on. Just like kind of adds to the experience, but I don't think it really changes much.
Okay. Because at least for me, I think like they can kind of be understood as part of the same project, I guess. Like, I think that you can view it in almost like a Gödel Escherbach way, where like
Yeah,
the stories are meant to drive home a lot of the themes of his nonfiction, which I think is true to some degree.
yeah, and some of his nonfiction is like it. It's like an essay, but it's like that doesn't like have a thesis and stuff. It's very much like kind of just like saying examples of things or just like talking about random things to sort of try and get you to come away with a certain idea in like the way fiction does, even if it's nonfiction. And then it's like fiction kind of does this as well, and it's sort of, I feel like there's almost like a continuum from like very nonfiction to like sort of fictiony nonfiction to sort of nonfictiony fiction to like pretty fictiony fiction, and this kind of, you can find it all.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the thing that Scott Alexander is best at, which I think is partially why he has such a big following amongst tech people, is that he's really good at just kind of ejecting an idea into the idea space and then having a lot of people find this idea, like to an even greater extent than he is at getting people to find his work. Like, I think a lot of people just encounter his ideas many levels down from like the post and just not even know that he was responsible for like shitting this idea into the idea space. For example, there was this one time where I got really into the theory behind the book Albion Seed, which is like this basically like unreadable tome that is at the same time very insightful about how these four different ethno-religious groups that seeded America ended up creating our modern day blue America and red America tribes. After reading about it for a while, I realized that most of its popularity can be traced all the way back to the Scott Alexander review of the book Albion Seed, which I then remember that I had actually come across in the past, but just like didn't really remember. And I was like, like, first of all, it's interesting that I like that that's the case, but like I also wonder if the original article kind of like primed my brain in some way to discover it later. I actually feel like that's happened a few times where like I will encounter some Scott Alexander idea and just not really think much of it. But then like a couple years later or something, I'll just be thinking about this idea a lot. I'm like, it really kind of does like almost like he's doing witchcraft in your brain or something.
Yeah, that's kind of wild. Yeah, the Scott Alexander Albion Seed review was my first introduction to him, and I guess like rationalism in general even. Good review, but also pretty different from the majority of his content. All right, I think that's a good time to wrap things up. Kevin, do you have any short fiction recommendation to send us off with?
Yeah, I have been on a bit of a Chinese science fiction kick recently, and I would like to recommend the story Folding Beijing by the writer Hao Jingfang. This is a story that was published in Uncanny Magazine and translated by Ken Liu. This story basically explores a version of Beijing that's stratified into three different zones of very different levels of wealth. And the city kind of just like how they deal with unemployment, I guess, is they just have like less people conscious for like the period of the day. And so the city is just kind of like this like double-sided pancake where like every cycle it kind of just like rotates and like a different part of humanity kind of like gets their shit being alive. Like everyone sleeps for like the normal amount plus the amount that like is necessary to keep them out of the labor pool. They have like more jobs for everyone. And it's about like this one dude who just kind of lives in like the shittiest part of this folding Beijing city, and his journey to deliver a message to someone who lives in the more affluent part of it. I wouldn't say the story is like hard speculative fiction. You know, it's more about like the vibes and the atmosphere, but it has a lot of vibes. I can say that much.
Yeah, it does sound, yeah, just conceptually like really satisfying to read. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you all next week.